If there's one thing that I learned in the last, I don't know, 20-something years of being in music ministry, it's that playing a proper build on the drums, the way you lift up a certain section of a song or lead into a certain section of a song, has a huge, huge effect in playing worship music. And it's important to be able to do this type of thing effectively. So this video is to sort of just give you my kind of approach, I guess, to playing these types of builds in the middle of worship songs. Some tips and some things that I think about to make sure that what I'm doing is affecting the room and the song and everyone else the way it should. When you're building up a section on the drums, you're literally taking an entire room full of people from one place to another place. So you can imagine if you're timid with that, you know what I mean? If you don't play it with a certain level of confidence, then it can really affect the mood in kind of a, not necessarily a negative way, but it's just not effective. So you want to be able to play with a certain level of authority, and when you're playing these types of builds on the drums, your approach has a huge part of how it affects the room. So there are two things that I consider every single time I go to play a build on the drums, and that's dynamics and the subdivision. This is the recipe that I use to play my builds. And they're normally how I end up doing it depends on the tempo of the song and the overall feel, like the rhythmic feel of the song. The other thing that I consider is the length of the build. That'll also help me to determine how I'm going to play it. Because sometimes it's a 2-bar build. Sometimes you're leading into a section, through an 8-bar build. So you really need to leave space for that 8 bars to grow. So these kind of things I sort of think about and consider before I decide how I'm going to play it. Effectively, what you want to try to do is just produce yourself, right? I mean, you should be doing that the entire time anyway, but when you're producing yourself, you're making musical decisions that will help to enhance the song or that particular moment or whatever, right? So I'm going to give you 6 different examples I have written on here that are going to maybe just give you some ideas of how you can start to approach playing builds and songs, okay? So the first one is just going to be a basic 8th-note build. So, nice slow tempo. Generally what I do, always use the floor tom. Use the biggest floor tom you got, because builds, by the time you get to the end of it, they need to be huge. You know what I mean? So you don't want to build on just a snare. That's not going to be effective at all. So I use the floor tom, I use the kick, and I use the snare. And then I'll get into some examples where you can involve the cymbals as well. But 8th notes, simple 8th-note build. Right hand, right foot, left hand. And I just slowly ramp up 8 notes from the build. The second type of build that you can play, if the tempo is slow enough and there's room, you can play like a slow 16th note build. Same idea, and that looks like this. Now, another thing that I'll do sometimes is I'll use both. I'll use 8ths and 16ths, and I'll layer them somehow. So for example, if it's a long build, if it's a 4-bar or 8-bar build, I'll start playing 8th notes, and then maybe halfway through it, I'll start to play 16ths over top of it, still playing 8ths on the kick and the snare or whatever else I'm doing with my left hand. But I'll sort of layer 16th notes on top of the 8ths, and it just gives even more headroom for the build. So when you come out of it, it's nice and huge. And during the build too, like you can feel things intensify. That's the biggest thing about playing a build, is you need to feel the gradual intensity through that build, no matter how short or how long it is. So here's that example: 8ths underneath with 16ths on the floor top. Now, another thing that I like to do in some situations is that I'll blanket the build with some type of wash, usually with either a crash or sometimes I'll use the hi-hats as well. And this requires a bit of a subtle touch, like you can't be aggressive with it because you're building the cymbal along with everything else, right? So, so here's that example. I'll play a bit of a build, but I'll include the crash, and then I'll bring both of these up at the same time. Now, another idea that I'll do in situations where we're dealing with longer builds especially, is that I'll start out on the kick and the floor, maybe the hats, but then maybe halfway through it I'll sort of fade in the snare drum and then start sort of ramping up on the snare as well. And it just kind of adds that top end dynamic, you know what I mean? And it just makes it feel a little bit bigger and chunkier. Now, this last one I'm going to show you is a bonus. It's kind of my signature move. I've been doing this for a long time. But one thing that I really love to do, and surprisingly, this does not disrupt anything that's going on. But what I'll do is, if we're coming out of a super quiet section, maybe I'm just keeping some light time on the ride. Once I sense that the build is happening, one thing that I like to do is punch the top of the build really hard, either with the crash or sometimes with the floor tom or whatever. But I'll just put a huge spike at the beginning of that build, drop it right down, and then gradually bring it up again. You'd be surprised at the effect something like this does, because I've looked out sometimes when I've done this, and I can see the effect that it has on people. It's like you just smack them in the face and you let them know that things are about to change. You know what I mean? You're giving them a sense that something's coming when you do this. So that's a bit of a signature move of mine. I'll punch the top of that build really hard. And again, drop it right back down to 0 and then slowly bring it up. This is the type of thing that's going to take you from drummer to musician. You know what I mean? Once you start to get in the whole habit of thinking a lot more like a producer and a musician when you play, then, you know, it changes everything. Changes everything, and you just end up sounding way better and way more effective. Don't be a timid worship drummer. Timid worship drummers are not effective. Play with confidence, play with control, you know, continue to work on your technique. All that stuff's going to help. And that's it. That's all I got for you. So take that, run with it, take it or leave it. It's all up to you. Like, subscribe. See you next video.